The air in northern Wisconsin has a silence of its own, especially in winter. It's the kind of silence that swallows sound, where you can hear your own breath and the crunch of snow beneath your boots feels louder than it should. In December 1978, that silence fell heavy over the small town of Crandon, where 22-year-old Mary Jean Ellison was last seen alive. Mary wasn't the kind of person anyone expected to vanish. She grew up just a few miles out of town, in a small farmhouse with her parents and two younger brothers. She worked part-time at the local grocery store, sang in the church choir, and had dreams of becoming a nurse. People remembered her as kind and a little shy, the sort of young woman who always said thank you and meant it. On the night of December 9, 1978, Crandon was wrapped in a thick layer of snow. Mary had been invited to a friend's small Christmas get-together, nothing fancy, just music, food, and beer around a wood stove. She left around 10:30 p.m., waving goodbye, promising to call the next morning. Her old Ford Pinto started up fine despite the cold. She lived just 5 miles down County Road W. It should have been a 10-minute drive. But she never made it home. The next morning, when Mary's mother saw her bed untouched, she called everyone she could think of, friends, the grocery store, even the sheriff. Within hours, her father was driving the roads himself, looking for tire marks or a stalled car in the ditch. He found nothing. That Sunday, deputies from the Forest County Sheriff's Office began their search. They found Mary's car 2 days later, abandoned on a narrow stretch of logging road about a mile off her route home. The driver's door was unlocked. Her purse was on the front seat. The keys were still in the ignition. There were no signs of a struggle, no footprints except her own. It was as if she had simply stepped out of her car and disappeared into the frozen woods. For a town of just 2,000 people, it was unthinkable. People who had never locked their doors before started doing it that week. Church sermons turned into prayers for Mary. Her mother stood in the front pew every Sunday, clutching a small silver cross and waiting for a miracle that never came. The search went on for weeks. Dozens of volunteers combed the snow-covered woods with dogs, sticks, and flashlights. The sheriff's office brought in divers to search a frozen creek nearby. By January, temperatures dropped below zero, and the search was suspended until spring. When the thaw came in April 1979, a hunter found a woman's scarf caught on a branch near a marshy area south of town. It was Mary's, but her body wasn't there. By summer, the investigation had no leads. Theories began to spread. She'd run away, she'd been kidnapped by a stranger passing through, or maybe someone she knew was responsible. But there was no evidence, no witnesses, no body. For Mary's parents, life became a cycle of waiting. Every phone call, every letter from the sheriff's office carried the same words: "We're still working on it." And then time moved on. Crandon changed. People grew older, new families moved in, and Mary Ellison's disappearance slowly turned from a headline into a story whispered by older residents. But for those who had known her, especially her mother, it was never just a story. It was a wound that never closed. No one could have known that buried deep within an old evidence locker, a single item from 1978, a piece of evidence overlooked for decades, would one day unlock the truth. But that day was still more than 40 years away. As summer 1979 stretched into fall, the Forest County Sheriff's Office kept a skeleton crew assigned to Mary's case, but leads were scarce. Tips came in occasionally. A trucker passing through town remembered a young woman hitchhiking late one night. A neighbor claimed to have seen a suspicious car on County Road W, but nothing concrete emerged. The sheriff's office interviewed friends, co-workers, and distant relatives. Everyone described Mary the same way: bright, compassionate, careful, a young woman who never took unnecessary risks. The absence of a body made it almost impossible to pursue charges. Without evidence, a murder case couldn't move forward. With nothing but her abandoned car and a scarf, the investigation slowly turned into a waiting game. Officers logged every tip in the case file, but as months became years, the energy behind the search waned. New cases emerged, accidents, thefts, other disappearances, and resources shifted elsewhere. Mary's parents, Robert and Clara Ellison, refused to give up hope. They spent evenings walking the snowy roads, calling friends and posting flyers at the grocery store and post office. Each holiday, they left her empty chair at the family dinner, holding out for news that never came. Local newspapers revisited the case occasionally, especially around the anniversary of her disappearance, but each article ended with the same sentence: the case remains unsolved. By the 1980s, Crandon had changed. Logging trucks became louder, new roads cut through previously untouched woods, and younger residents moved away for college or work. Mary's disappearance became one of those town mysteries that people whispered about but didn't expect to solve. Some teenagers dared each other to drive down County Road W at night, joking about Mary's ghost, but the laughter always carried a shadow of fear. In 1985, a hiker stumbled across a small, rusted tin box buried under fallen leaves near a creek several miles from where Mary's car was found. Inside were a few personal items: a handkerchief, a silver charm bracelet, but none belonged to Mary. Still, the discovery reignited hope. For a short time, detectives reopened interviews, questioning every resident and logging hundreds of pages of notes. But forensic technology in 1978, and even by 1985, could do little with these items. Fibers were inconclusive, fingerprints smudged by time, and there was no way to link the objects to a suspect. Once again, the case faded into silence. Through the 1990s, Robert and Clara grew older. Their energy waned, but not their resolve. They hired a private investigator, someone who had a reputation for solving long, cold cases. The investigator reviewed the original sheriff's files meticulously. He examined witness statements, mapped the locations of Mary's last known movements, and even revisited old search areas. He concluded that someone local had likely been responsible. Someone familiar with the woods, the roads, and her schedule. But he, too, found no proof. Meanwhile, across Wisconsin, advances in forensic science were slowly transforming the way cold cases could be approached. DNA analysis had begun to identify unknown perpetrators in crimes that once seemed unsolvable. Yet Mary's case had a major obstacle: no body, no preserved biological evidence beyond a scarf and the items found later. Without a preserved sample of hair, blood, or skin, there was nothing to test. By the early 2000s, Mary Ellison's name had slipped from national awareness. Local residents who remembered the case could still recount it in detail: how carefully she had lived, how her car had been found on that frozen December road. But the world outside Crandon had largely forgotten. For her parents, every day was a reminder of what had been stolen from their lives: a daughter, a future, a voice. They refused to abandon the search, though. They compiled binders of old newspaper clippings, photographs of Mary, witness statements, and personal letters from concerned friends. They met with detectives whenever possible, asking the same question they had for over 2 decades: did you check everything? In 2010, the Wisconsin Department of Justice launched a statewide review of cold cases, prompted by growing national awareness of cold case forensic breakthroughs. Mary's case file, still labeled unsolved from 1978, was pulled from the archive. Detectives scanned the documents, took inventory of the evidence, and noted the items preserved over the years: the abandoned car, Mary's scarf, the small tin box, and some personal items collected from the last known location she had been seen alive. It was a small collection, but enough to spark the possibility of something new. Around this time, forensic genealogy began emerging as a powerful tool. Investigators realized that even a degraded sample, something previously dismissed as unusable, could provide DNA that might eventually identify a family line or link to a potential suspect. For Mary's case, it was a long shot, but it was the only shot left. By 2015, investigators assigned to cold cases began re-examining Mary's evidence. They focused on the scarf discovered by the hiker, hoping that fibers, skin cells, or even traces of hair could survive decades in storage. It had been sealed in a controlled locker for years, untouched, in case technology ever caught up. Labs in Madison tested what they could, swabbing and sequencing what little remained. Forensic scientists worked meticulously, knowing that any recovered DNA could lead to a breakthrough. Mary Ellison's disappearance, once a story whispered in a small Wisconsin town, had sat dormant for nearly 4 decades. Yet the preservation of evidence and the quiet persistence of her parents, paired with modern science, meant that the case was not gone. It was waiting for the day someone finally had the tools to catch up with time itself. It was February 2019 when the first real break in Mary Ellison's case came, over 40 years after she vanished. The Wisconsin Cold Case Task Force, a team of detectives and forensic specialists dedicated to long unsolved crimes, had begun systematically reviewing decades-old evidence with modern technology. Mary's case was among the oldest files they prioritized. The scarf, long dismissed as a sentimental memento rather than evidence, was carefully re-examined. For decades, touch DNA was impossible to extract from such fragile items, but modern methods had changed the game. Specialists swabbed the fibers repeatedly, looking for microscopic skin cells, traces left behind by someone who had handled the fabric. Weeks passed with little result, and the task force began to wonder if even this technological leap would be enough. Then quietly there it was. A faint, partial DNA profile emerged. It wasn't a full match, too much time had passed, and the sample was degraded. But it was enough to upload into genealogical databases, the same technology that had revolutionized cold case investigations across the country. Analysts began building family trees from the partial match, tracing connections through public ancestry profiles. By late summer 2019, the trail led to a family in northern Illinois. One branch contained a man who had lived in Forest County in 1978. He was a stranger to criminal history, a man known in town only as quiet and reserved, someone who worked seasonal labor on farms and rarely socialized. Yet the genealogical mapping, combined with other circumstantial patterns, pointed directly to him, Harold Dean Mercer. Investigators dug into his past. In 1978, Mercer was 27 years old, living less than 10 miles from where Mary's car was found. Neighbors described him as reclusive, but a few recalled odd incidents. A woman reporting that he had followed her home one evening, another recalling a confrontation in a diner where he seemed unusually fixated on a young woman's movements. None of these events had resulted in police reports at the time. Now they were seen in a chilling new light. Law enforcement knew they needed direct confirmation. They conducted discreet surveillance, hoping to collect DNA without tipping Mercer off. Days of observation passed. Then, in October 2019, a discarded coffee cup from a local cafe provided the crucial sample. Laboratory analysis confirmed a match with the touch DNA extracted from the scarf. It was conclusive. Harold Mercer had handled the fabric that had once belonged to Mary Ellison. With probable cause established, the Wisconsin State Police coordinated with the Forest County Sheriff's Office to plan an arrest. They moved quickly, aware that the man had lived quietly for decades and could flee if warned. On November 12, 2019, officers approached Mercer's small home on the outskirts of a neighboring town. He answered the door calmly, seemingly unaware of why they were there. One officer quietly read the arrest warrant: first-degree murder, unlawful restraint, and tampering with evidence. Mercer's calm demeanor never wavered. He did not resist, but he did not speak. The arrest sent shockwaves through the region. Crandon, a town that had aged nearly 40 years without resolution, felt the tremor of disbelief. Residents remembered Mary as the sweet, quiet girl who had disappeared on that winter night and never returned. The man who had been walking among them all these years, quiet, invisible, unnoticed, was finally facing the consequences. The investigation didn't stop there. A search of Mercer's property revealed evidence that tied him even more firmly to the crime. In an old toolbox buried under a tarp in his garage, authorities found Mary's personal effects: a silver locket, a notebook with handwriting they recognized, and several items matching descriptions in the original sheriff's file. Among them was a small, rusted metal container that had once held personal trinkets, possibly overlooked during the initial 1978 investigation. The presence of these items was damning. They had never left the local area but were in Mercer's possession the entire time. For Mary's family, the arrest was surreal. Robert and Clara Ellison, now in their 80s, could hardly process that justice, delayed by over 40 years, was finally within reach. Their grief remained, raw and unhealed, but at last they had someone to hold accountable. The case would now move toward trial, and while challenges loomed, defense lawyers arguing about the age of evidence and the reliability of partial DNA, the breakthrough had shattered the decades-long silence. After 41 years, the small town of Crandon would finally confront the truth of what had happened that December night in 1978. The trial of Harold Dean Mercer began on a chilly morning in March 2020 at the Forest County Courthouse. After more than 4 decades, the town of Crandon was packed with residents, journalists, and distant relatives who had followed the story for years. Emotions ran high. The courtroom felt heavy with anticipation, the air thick with decades of unanswered questions and grief finally brought into the light. Mary's parents, Robert and Clara Ellison, sat in the front row, hands clasped tightly, faces lined with years of sorrow. Their eyes, though weary, were fixed on the man who had eluded justice for so long. Beside them sat friends who had never given up hope, including Mary's childhood neighbor, Laura Benson, who remembered the girl's quiet laughter echoing down the snowy streets of Crandon. Prosecutors opened with a clear, compelling narrative. They described Mary's life, her routine, the day she disappeared, and the painstaking investigation that had lasted decades. Every detail of the original case was presented: the abandoned car on County Road W, the scarf discovered in the woods, the missing personal items, and the faint traces of DNA that finally pointed to Mercer. Forensic experts took the stand. They explained how the scarf, preserved in controlled conditions for 40 years, had yielded enough touch DNA to construct a partial profile. They demonstrated how genealogical mapping connected the profile to Mercer, and how DNA from a discarded coffee cup conclusively matched the touch sample. Each piece of evidence was laid out carefully, logically, methodically. The courtroom held its breath as lab technicians described decades-old fibers, preserved personal effects, and the meticulous chain of custody that had kept the evidence uncontaminated. Witnesses from the 1978 investigation also testified. Some had long since retired but returned to recount memories of searching snowy woods, following dead-end leads, and the heartbreak of seeing Mary's parents return home empty-handed. Their voices, calm yet tinged with sorrow, painted a vivid picture of frustration, diligence, and the enduring human cost of a case left unsolved for decades. Then came the testimony that left the courtroom stunned. A former neighbor recalled seeing Mercer behaving oddly the night Mary disappeared. He had been walking near County Road W around dusk, carrying something small and metallic, which could have been the container later found in his garage. Another witness described hearing a car engine start and stop near the same road on that fateful evening. Each memory, faded by time, suddenly took on new significance. The defense moved quickly to cast doubt. They argued that the evidence was too old, that memories could not be trusted after 40 years, and that partial DNA profiles carried inherent uncertainties. They questioned the reliability of genealogical DNA, claiming it could not definitively prove Mercer's guilt. They argued that circumstantial evidence alone should not convict a man who had lived quietly, unpunished, for 4 decades. Yet the prosecution's case was relentless. They emphasized the physical evidence, Mary's personal items in Mercer's possession, the DNA match, the scarf, and the metal container, all pointing directly to him. They highlighted the pattern of his past behavior, the witness accounts, and the consistency of his location with Mary's last known movements. They portrayed a man who had hidden in plain sight, whose outward invisibility masked a history of obsession and control. Closing arguments were emotional. Prosecutors spoke directly to the jury about the decades of pain endured by Mary's family and the enduring quest for justice. They reminded everyone that the passage of time could not erase the truth, and that Mary's voice, though silenced, demanded to be heard. The defense, in contrast, pleaded for caution, emphasizing the risks of convicting on evidence that had aged, urging jurors to consider the decades-long gap and the possible contamination. The jury deliberated for 5 tense days. Each day stretched into night as they reviewed evidence, debated the credibility of witnesses, and weighed decades of testimony against the defense's arguments. The town waited with bated breath, the weight of history pressing down on everyone who had followed the case. Finally, on March 27, 2020, the foreperson of the jury stood and delivered the verdict. Guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted, soft sobs from Mary's family, silent tears from friends, gasps from observers. Robert and Clara collapsed into each other's arms, a lifetime of grief momentarily broken by the relief of justice. Even after 42 years, the truth had prevailed. Mercer was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His calm, almost indifferent demeanor in court did little to mask the gravity of his conviction. The sentence sent a message: time may pass, but crimes do not go unpunished forever. The town of Crandon, still small and tightly knit, struggled with the mix of relief and lingering sorrow. Candlelight vigils, once held annually in Mary's memory, now carried a different tone, less uncertainty, more closure. Residents who had grown up hearing whispers about her disappearance finally had answers. Some felt vindication, others an uneasy reflection on how easily danger had hidden itself in plain sight. Mary's parents worked to channel their relief into purpose. They collaborated with the Forest County Historical Society and local schools to create the Mary Ellison Memorial Fund, dedicated to supporting missing person awareness and education. The fund aimed to prevent other families from enduring decades of unanswered questions. Her story also sparked interest beyond Crandon. Wisconsin law enforcement agencies cited the case as a model for cold case reviews, showing how preservation of evidence and modern forensic technology could solve even decades-old mysteries. The case encouraged the funding of cold case units and the training of officers in genealogical DNA analysis, ensuring Mary's tragedy would save lives and bring justice in future cases. Even after the trial, the shadow of Mary's loss remained. 42 years of absence could not be erased, and her parents would always grieve the daughter they had lost. But at last, the silence that had haunted them was broken. The town of Crandon had confronted its oldest mystery, faced its long-held fears, and finally, in the quiet aftermath, found a measure of peace. In the quiet months following Harold Dean Mercer's conviction, Crandon began to breathe again, though the weight of decades lingered. Streets that had once echoed with whispers of suspicion now carried the soft relief of closure, but the community knew that life had been irrevocably altered. 42 years of unanswered questions had left scars that would never fully heal. Mary Ellison's parents, Robert and Clara, found solace in knowing the man responsible had finally been held accountable, but they also recognized the permanence of their loss. They could no longer celebrate birthdays or see milestones in her life. They could only honor her memory, keep her story alive, and ensure that her absence served a purpose beyond grief. Through the Mary Ellison Memorial Fund, scholarships were established for students pursuing careers in law enforcement, forensic science, and advocacy for missing persons. The fund aimed to transform tragedy into vigilance, teaching future generations the importance of careful evidence preservation and the relentless pursuit of justice. Local schools incorporated Mary's story into history and civic lessons, highlighting not only the dangers of oversight and the value of community vigilance, but also the remarkable power of perseverance. Teachers encouraged students to learn from the meticulous work of cold case investigators and the transformative impact of modern forensic science, particularly genealogical DNA analysis. Mary's disappearance and eventual resolution became a case study, showing that no crime should ever be forgotten, no evidence dismissed, and no family's anguish ignored. Crandon itself began to commemorate her life in tangible ways. A small memorial park was established near the woods where Mary had disappeared, featuring a stone plaque engraved with her name, dates, and the words, "Forever seen, forever remembered." Surrounding the memorial, native Wisconsin flora was planted, wildflowers, white birch saplings, and towering oaks, symbolizing both the fragility and endurance of life. Residents and visitors leave flowers, small tokens, and notes, remembering a young woman whose story had once been silenced. The case also had broader implications for law enforcement across Wisconsin and neighboring states. Investigators cited Mary Ellison's case in conferences and training seminars, emphasizing the importance of proper evidence preservation, even in cases that seem hopeless. The use of touch DNA and genealogical analysis in her case inspired legislation to fund cold case units, improve storage conditions for evidence, and establish cross-state collaboration. In a way, Mary's life and tragic death became a catalyst for systemic change, ensuring that countless other cases would have a chance at resolution. Journalists and documentarians revisited her story, creating photo essays, articles, and short films that not only recounted the crime and investigation, but also celebrated her life, passions, and dedication. They highlighted her love of photography, her quiet curiosity, and the connections she forged in her community. Mary had been a young woman who noticed the small details in life, the gestures, the smiles, the fleeting moments that often went unseen. Even in death, she became a symbol of vigilance and human dignity, reminding people that every life matters and every story deserves to be told. Her parents, though forever marked by loss, found comfort in the enduring resonance of Mary's story. Each year, on the anniversary of her disappearance, they joined neighbors, friends, and students at the memorial park. Candles were lit, flowers placed, and moments of silence observed. These gatherings transformed grief into a collective affirmation. Memory matters, justice matters, and even decades later, truth can prevail. Across Crandon and beyond, Mary Ellison's story continues to reverberate. It reminds communities of the fragility of life, the persistence of memory, and the profound importance of never giving up on justice. Her case illustrates that even when time stretches over decades, when evidence seems lost and hope fades, breakthroughs can occur. And when they do, they can restore dignity, provide closure, and inspire systemic change. In the end, Mary Jean Ellison is more than a solved cold case. She is a testament to the power of persistence, the impact of careful observation, and the enduring necessity of compassion. She was a young woman who loved deeply, lived with purpose, and whose absence left a void no one could fill. Yet through the courage of investigators, the perseverance of her family, and the advancement of forensic science, her voice was finally heard. Her story asks something of all who hear it. Pay attention, act with care, preserve the truth, and never let a life slip into silence. Mary Ellison's legacy endures not just in memorials or legal reforms, but in the countless people inspired to notice, remember, and seek justice, long after the snow had melted on that December night in 1978. Her name is remembered, her story is told, and though 42 years passed before justice came, Mary Jean Ellison's light shines still, guiding the living, honoring the lost, and reminding the world that some truths, no matter how long buried, will eventually be uncovered.